Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Jameel Jaffer. I'm the director of the Knight Institute. One of the challenges in establishing a new First Amendment Institute now is that it can be difficult to distinguish the most significant threats to First Amendment freedoms from the threats that are the loudest. Another challenge, perhaps a more daunting one, is that the meaning of the First Amendment is unsettled in so many respects. And an organization tasked with defending First Amendment freedoms is defending a set of guarantees whose purpose and meaning are deeply contested. A third challenge is situating the work we do now in the arc of American history. How does the work that we and other free speech advocates do today relate to the work that others did before us? What baton has been passed to us? And still another challenge is understanding the relation of the work we do here in the United States to the work being done, often in much more difficult conditions, by free expression advocates in other parts of the world. So this is the Knight Institute's inaugural public program. And I thought carefully about who might be able to help us begin to answer those questions. And I couldn't think of anyone more qualified in this respect than Aryeh Neier. And it's truly an honor to have him here with us today. For many people of great stature, it's a form of praise to say that they need no introduction. Well, Aryeh needs no introduction, but reviewing some of his experiences and accomplishments is itself a way of beginning to answer some of the questions that confront us. In the 1970s, when Aryeh was in his 30s and executive director of the ACLU, one of the most divisive cases in American law involved the National Socialist Party of America and the right of its members to march in uniform, swastikas on armbands, through Skokie, Illinois. 40,000 Jews, many of them Holocaust survivors, lived in that village of 70,000 people. Arier argued that the neo-Nazis should be permitted to march, and for this he was criticized and even vilified by many people who had previously supported him. By then, he'd helped to double the ACLU's membership to about 275,000 people, but 15% of the ACLU's constituents renounced their membership because of the organization's role in the Skokie case. The ACLU paid a price for its principles, and so did Arier. Demonstrators disrupted the ACLU office here in New York, and they followed Arier home so they could demonstrate where he and his wife lived. Arier was born in Nazi Germany, and his parents fled with him to England in 1939 when he was 2 years old, shortly before Germany invaded Poland and launched the Second World War. 8 years later, when he was 10, he and his family immigrated to the United States. As a Holocaust survivor, he felt a special responsibility to explain the ACLU's representation of the neo-Nazis. In his 1979 book called Defending My Enemy, he argued that minorities would suffer most from rules that allowed majorities to censor speech on the basis of political content. He argued that any true defense of the rule of law must entail a defense of those whom we despise and who may despise us. There's no way to preserve our own freedom, he wrote, without defending the freedom of our enemies. Arier seems always to have understood the deep connection between First Amendment freedoms and other fundamental rights. Freedom of speech was a core commitment of the ACLU when it was founded almost a century ago. But during Arier's tenure, the organization broadened its mandate to reproductive rights, gender equality, prisoners' rights, and a host of other important concerns. I was an ACLU lawyer for 14 years, so I know the organization well. It's changed in many ways since Arier left it, but it still very much bears his imprint. When Arier left the ACLU in 1978, he focused on bringing fundamental freedoms, including the freedoms of thought, conscience, religion, and belief, to the nations known as the Communist Bloc. He co-founded an organization called Helsinki Watch, which advocated for the protection of human rights described in the Helsinki Accords, which was signed by the United States, Canada, and almost all European nations, 35 nations in all. Helsinki Watch eventually became Human Rights Watch, with Aryeh its leader for a dozen years. He built it from a modest and fairly obscure institution into one of the world's most influential human rights organizations. But it was through his work at the Open Society Foundations that Aryeh helped turn the human rights movement into a global force. In the 20 years that he was the organization's president, the Open Society Foundations grew from being grant makers focused primarily on Eastern Europe into a truly international network. By the end of his presidency 5 years ago, OSF was engaged with every region of the world, sometimes as the sole supporter of efforts to promote civil and political liberties and protect the rights of minorities, democratic governance, and respect for the rule of law. In the New York Review of Books, Michael Ignatieff wrote that if George Soros is the only American citizen with a foreign policy all his own, Nyer has been his Secretary of State. In his memoirs, Taking Liberties, Aryeh acknowledges that he has a reputation for being strong-willed. If you read the memoir, you'll find plenty of evidence that this reputation is well-deserved. In this case, however, strong-willed means resolute and decisive against the forces of tyranny and totalitarianism. In addition to requiring intelligence and fortitude, the work he's done so remarkably has required a fierce dedication, which he has demonstrated for 6 decades. It's an indication of how much he has accomplished that I am only now, at the end of my long introduction, getting around to mentioning, almost as an aside, that Aryeh was involved in the founding of 3 organizations focusing specifically on free speech: the Committee to Protect Journalists, Article 19, and the Media Legal Defense Initiative. It's a privilege for me to introduce Aryeh Neier, a visionary and immigrant who has done as much as any native-born American to protect and strengthen the rights of people in this country, and a defender of human rights around the world.
Thank you very much for that overly generous introduction. It's really a great pleasure for me to join in celebrating the establishment of the Knight Center. My own view is that its establishment at this moment is particularly appropriate. It's a moment when freedom of expression is under severe attack in many parts of the world. Such attacks are not new, of course. What is new, however, is the role of the United States. Though the policies of our government were never consistent, on balance, during the past 4 decades, the United States stood up for free expression. When it did so unambiguously, its stand mattered. Our one reason, of course, is that the United States is a great economic, military, and political power. Another reason is that the United States generally upheld free expression in its own practices. That is, the United States had credibility when it spoke up for free expression. A recent episode that indicates the changes in the United States policy was the visit to the White House last month of Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. While Sisi was defense minister, he presided over the massacre of more than 800 mostly peaceful protesters on a single day in August 2013, almost certainly a much larger number of killings on one day that took place in the Tiananmen Square protests in Beijing a quarter century earlier. Subsequently, General and then President Sisi has been responsible for the imprisonment of journalists and human rights defenders for peaceful activities. His jails are filled with political prisoners, many of whom have been tortured. The Obama administration did not take a strong stand on these issues, but it would not receive Sisi at the White House, nor was it entirely silent about them. Secretary of State John Kerry held up U.S. military aid to Egypt because he said the country was not engaged in a democratic transition. when President Sisi's visit to the White House took place 4 weeks ago, nothing was said publicly about that indicated concern about freedom of expression in Egypt. President Trump's main public statement was that Sisi is doing a fantastic job. Of course, we don't know if anything was said in private. Even if the matter was raised behind closed doors, however, it probably made no difference. An administration that portrays itself as at war with the press, that denounces the press as an enemy of the people, that attacks the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, and CNN as purveyors of fake news, and proclaims its intent on changing the libel laws so as to make it easier to sue the press, has little chance of persuading another government to respect freedom of expression. Unfortunately, Egypt, by far the largest of the Arab states, is far from alone among important governments now taking harsh measures against those attempting to practice freedom of expression. Turkey has imprisoned large numbers of journalists and forced hundreds of non-governmental organizations to shut down because they promote causes that do not coincide with government policies. President Trump's quick phone call to congratulate President Erdogan on his narrow victory in a referendum a week ago to enlarge greatly his own powers followed a campaign in which his opponents were largely excluded from presenting their views, is a further sign of his administration's disdain for freedom of the press. And I would say that the blocking of Wikipedia is only the latest example of President Erdogan's hostility to any point of view that does not echo his own. Russia has made peaceful dissent very dangerous. Peaceful protesters are beaten and jailed, and assassinations of journalists, human rights activists, and opposition political figures play an important role in suppressing public criticism of President Vladimir Putin. The voice of the United States was not as strong as human rights advocates would like during the previous administration in denouncing abuses of this sort by geopolitically significant governments. Now, however, there is virtually no prospect that the United States will say anything or do anything which would have an impact that protects freedom of expression. Up to now, the administration's quarrel with the United States, who criticize its policies, has been mainly rhetorical. It has not tried to jail journalists or peaceful dissenters or to take other legal measures against them. Will it continue to be a war of words or a war of tweets? I don't know. Yet it is worth recalling that American history has included several significant periods in which the federal government dealt with dissent as if it were treason. Most often, that took place in periods in which there were real or imagined threats to national security. If we again encounter such a period for reasons we cannot now predict, that is when we are likely to find out whether the current administration will try to put into practice measures that enforce the president's distaste for free expression. He would not be the first to do so. It is possible to identify 6 periods in the past century in which the federal government engaged in severe violations of rights in response to perceived threats to national security. In most cases, the main target of such attacks was freedom of expression. One of the most concerted attacks on freedom of expression started under President Woodrow Wilson almost exactly a century ago when the United States entered World War I. Those opposing American entry into the war and those opposing the draft were treated as traitors. They were prosecuted by the federal government under the 1917 Espionage Act and the 1918 Sedition Act, and by state governments under state equivalents. A leading scholar of freedom of speech, Harvard Law professor Zechariah Chafee, Jr., counted some 1,900 prosecutions for speech during this period. Sentences for mild statements against the war or the draft were lengthy, 5 years, 10 years, or even 20 years in prison. One of the federal prisoners was Socialist Party presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs, who ran for president from prison and got about 1 million votes. Debs and a few of the other protesters were pardoned by President Warren Harding at Christmas 1921, 3 years after the war ended. Many others had to wait longer until Calvin Coolidge's presidency before they were pardoned. The period immediately after the war ended was no better. A Red Scare in reaction to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and labor strikes by radical unions made this the second of these periods of perceived threats to national security. A series of terrorist bombings, including one that destroyed the home of Wilson's Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, and killed the man who placed the bomb, inflamed public opinion. Though the terrorists were never identified, Attorney General Palmer instructed the Justice Department's Bureau of Investigation to round up suspected radicals. This was done by conducting a series of raids and summarily deporting a few hundred of those rounded up to Soviet Russia. The raids ended in early 1920 when a federal judge in Boston ordered the release of some of those rounded up in one of the raids. The third major threat to national security of the past century was the outbreak of war in Europe in 1939. The director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover, who had led the roundups of radicals for Attorney General Palmer 2 decades earlier, and who had subsequently been instructed to desist from such practices by Calvin Coolidge's Attorney General Harlan Fiske Stone, used the threat of war to persuade President Franklin Roosevelt to enlarge the powers of the Bureau. Roosevelt issued an executive order directing the FBI to investigate subversives. It was this executive order that Hoover subsequently cited throughout his long tenure at the FBI until his death in 1972 to justify the Bureau's focus on dissenters, including the infamous campaign to discredit the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. In addition to enlarging the powers of the FBI, Roosevelt's actions in response to the threats to national security caused by the war included, of course, his order for the internment of more than 110,000 Japanese Americans for most of the war, and his failure to veto the Smith Act of 1940, which made it a federal crime to advocate the overthrow of the United States government. During World War II, there were just 2 prosecutions under the Smith Act, one involving a group of members of the Socialist Workers' Party, and the other involving a group of American fascists. Neither case seems to have involved anything more than harmless political speech. Probably one reason there were not more prosecutions under the Smith Act during the war was because those who served as United States Attorney General during that period, including Frank Murphy and Robert Jackson, who both subsequently became justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, were unenthusiastic about the law. Though the Smith Act was adopted as America's eventual involvement in World War II seemed likely, the period in which it became a larger factor in limiting free speech took place after the end of the war. During the post-World War II Red Scare that marked the onset of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, the fourth of these periods of major threats to national security, it became the principal instrument for prosecuting American communists. In 1951, the Supreme Court upheld its constitutionality. The matter was considered again by the Supreme Court in 1957, and although the court again upheld the law, this time its decision made the law unenforceable. That is because the Supreme Court required that advocacy could not be punishable if it was limited to abstract doctrine. It could only be punished constitutionally if a speaker called for specific concrete action, now or in the future. Simply being a communist committed to Marxist doctrine, expressing support for a revolution at some indeterminate point in time, could not be a crime. The post-World War II Red Scare was not limited to enforcement of the Smith Act, of course. Under the influence of Senator Joseph McCarthy, Senator Richard Nixon, and other members of Congress, and of the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover, who promoted a campaign against the communist threat, federal and state agencies adopted loyalty and security programs that cost many thousands of Americans their jobs. States enacted laws requiring public employees to take loyalty oaths. Many hundreds of persons were called before legislative investigative committees and questioned about their political beliefs and associations. Some were sent to prison when they declined to answer. Many colleges and universities adopted bans on speakers who had been accused of being communists. Hollywood movies and radio and television programs excluded writers, directors, and performers whose names appeared on blacklists, and countless other measures infringing on freedom of expression were adopted. It wasn't until the late 1950s, nearly a decade and a half after these measures were initially enacted, that the courts began to strike down those measures. Soon, however, starting in the early 1960s, yet another perceived threat to national security began to materialize, the fifth such period in the past century, opposition to the war in Vietnam. Millions of Americans took part in demonstrations against the war and against the draft. The overwhelming majority of them were peaceful demonstrations, yet great numbers of Americans were arrested. On a single day in May 1971, more than 13,000 anti-war demonstrators were arrested in Washington, D.C. The Nixon administration's Attorney General, John Mitchell, had announced that the federal government was taking over the policing of Washington, D.C., and his aide, William Rehnquist, declared that the Justice Department was imposing qualified martial law, whatever that meant. I was then the director of the American Civil Liberties Union, and as we had defended scores of thousands of other anti-war demonstrators in previous mass arrest cases, we defended almost all those who were arrested that day. We won nearly every case and eventually required the government to pay $12 million in damages to some of our clients for those illegal arrests in May 1971. The arrests of large numbers of peaceful demonstrators against the war, including some who burned draft cards and even flags, were not the only violations of free speech connected to the Vietnam War. Many young men who espoused or who expressed conscientious objection to the war, but did not belong to traditional peace churches or profess belief in a supreme being, were sent to prison, where others migrated to Canada or Sweden. The Selective Service System, which administered the draft, punitively reclassified those who it identified who took part in anti-war demonstrations and expedited efforts to send them to Vietnam, a practice we challenged successfully in the US Supreme Court. Political surveillance, an old tradition in the United States, reached new heights. The Johnson and Nixon administrations even deployed a large number of soldiers in the United States Army to conduct surveillance of anti-war groups, a practice the Supreme Court declined to strike down. The Nixon administration tried to censor the New York Times and the Washington Post to prevent their publication of the Pentagon Papers. And the Nixon administration secretly established the plumbers because it didn't trust the FBI and other federal law enforcement agencies to identify those responsible for leaks of information it wanted to hide, such as the fact that the United States had invaded Cambodia. Information about the secret invasion of Cambodia sparked additional demonstrations like the one at Kent State University in May 1970, at which the National Guard shot and killed 4 students and wounded another 13. Students all over the country left their classes to join protests against those killings, and many colleges and universities were unable to complete the academic year. As you know, the plumbers eventually helped to bring down Nixon because they bungled the attempt to place wiretaps on the phones in the offices of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate complex. In the wake of Nixon's fall, civil liberties litigation dismantled much of the country's system of political surveillance. Since then, however, a new system of political surveillance has developed to try to meet the most recent threat to national security, the 6th in the last century, international terrorism. One of the encouraging consequences of the turbulent and heated struggles over free expression during the Vietnam War period is that mass arrests and political surveillance did not seem to have a significant chilling effect. On the contrary, government efforts to suppress speech mainly provoked more speech. The myriad struggles in the streets, on college campuses, in the newsrooms, and in the courts persuaded ever larger numbers of people to express their views about the war and to make journalists and scholars dig deeper in their investigations. I think it is fair to say that investigative journalism came into its own during the Vietnam War period and the Nixon presidency. While we face threats to freedom of expression today, it would be a mistake to suggest that Americans have been cowed into silence. The positive legacy of the struggles of the Vietnam War years, more than 4 decades ago, has been a heightened commitment to freedom of expression by large numbers of Americans. Though we entered into a new period of political surveillance in the period after the devastating terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, I don't see signs that this has had a significant effect in suppressing speech. The journalist A.J. Liebling famously wrote that freedom of speech is guaranteed only to those who own one. Today, of course, technology has made it possible for everyone to own one. In that respect, by greatly enhancing the power to communicate, the internet is a great advance for freedom of expression. At the same time, however, the development of the internet and our reliance on electronic communications has provided a great opportunity to increase surveillance. Some of those engaged in surveillance are the private firms that gather vast amounts of information about us for commercial purposes. Others are government agencies that practice surveillance to try to detect criminal activity or to a far greater extent to try to enhance national security. At times there is a convergence as government tries to use the data gathered by commercial enterprises for their own purposes. In effect, as we use electronic information, electronic communications, we engage in a trade-off. We communicate much more easily and more widely than ever before. In exchange, we give up a portion of our privacy to those monitoring our communications for their business purposes or their public security purposes. There is a passage in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's novel, Cancer Ward, published in 1968, long before the development of the internet, which seems to me to capture well the way that surveillance of the internet endangers privacy. Solzhenitsyn wrote, "As every man goes through life, he fills in a number of forms for the record, each containing a number of questions. There are then hundreds of little threads radiating from every man, millions of threads in all. If these threads were suddenly to become visible, the whole sky would look like a spider's web, and if they materialized as rubber, trams, buses, trains, and even people would all lose the ability to move, and the wind would be unable to carry torn-up newspapers or autumn leaves along the streets of the city. They are not visible, they are not material, but every man is constantly aware of their existence." In Solzhenitsyn's time, it would have been cumbersome to pull together all the threads. No longer. Certainly, the National Security Agency is able to do so with great efficiency. In addition to imposing a burden on freedom of expression, surveillance also raises First Amendment issues because government tends to act secretly when engaged in such practices. President George W. Bush secretly authorized the National Security Agency to engage in warrantless surveillance of communications between Americans and persons outside the country. Subsequently, Edward Snowden revealed to us a great deal we had not known about the surveillance practices of our government. His revelations led to some reforms, and some Americans celebrate Snowden as a hero. Yet if the government gets its hands on him, he will probably go to prison for a long time. In addition to increased surveillance in the period since 9/11, we have also had a number of attempts by the federal government during the Obama administration to maintain secrecy and to try to curb leaks by using the World War I Espionage Act to prosecute government officials. This was accompanied by attempts to force journalists to disclose the identities of their sources. The Obama administration's actions, following in the footsteps of presidents such as Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, make it clear that neither political party has a monopoly on the readiness to use perceived or genuine threats to national security as a rationale for attacking First Amendment freedoms. Though American history is replete with restrictions on First Amendment rights, especially in periods when there are perceived threats to national security, it is also the case that there is a stronger tradition of philosophic commitment to freedom of speech and the press in the United States than in virtually any other country in the world. By its nature, however, policies that involve the regulation of the internet cannot be limited in their application by national boundaries. Restrictions elsewhere will limit rights here. The foremost value in American constitutional law on rights is freedom or liberty. On the other hand, the foremost value in European constitutional law and in the law of much of the rest of the world is dignity. Dignity is the principal value set forth in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights. It is a word, however, that is never mentioned in any of the fundamental documents of the United States. The difference between the American commitment to freedom or liberty and the commitment elsewhere to dignity plays out in many differences when it comes to speech or the press. To cite just one example, hate speech is protected as free speech in the United States, except when the context is one in which an incitement to violence takes place in circumstances that are imminently likely to lead to violence. In Europe and in most of the rest of the world, with their emphasis on dignity, the context matters less than the content. Hate speech can be proscribed regardless of the context if it demeans people on the basis of such criteria as race or religion. That is, if it deprives them of dignity. Differences in philosophy are also likely to produce differences in a range of internet-specific issues, starting with the so-called right to be forgotten, which Europeans see as an example, as an aspect of dignity. If the United States does not take a strong and consistent stand for freedom of expression, the chances are that its philosophic commitment to freedom or liberty will not fare well in the resolution of such questions internationally. The Knight Center has been established to enhance the protection of freedom of speech and the press in the digital age in the United States. I believe it will serve that purpose, and at the same time, it will contribute significantly to the protection of freedom of expression worldwide. Thank you.
I don't know if this, my question is Julian Assange. My name is David, and the question is Julian Assange and the U.S. government going after him for telling the truth to the world.
I have never favored the support of Julian Assange on First Amendment grounds. I don't think there is an inherent right to disseminate everything that the United States government wants to keep secret or confidential. There is a great deal of confidential information in the possession of the United States government, which could do a great deal of harm to many persons. I was personally involved in calling a number of journalists to try to prevent the publication of one bit of information that I thought would hurt somebody very badly in Egypt if it were disclosed. I would differentiate Julian Assange from Edward Snowden. I think that Snowden was engaged in a whistleblowing effort. He released information that the public had a right to know and that indicated misconduct by the United States government, especially after James Clapper testified before Congress and explicitly denied that the United States was engaged in the practices that Snowden disclosed. But Assange, with the promiscuous dissemination of everything, including things which were appropriately held confidentially and which were in no fashion whistleblowing efforts with respect to the United States government, does not deserve the same protection as Edward Snowden deserved.
Hi, my name is Matt. I'm fascinated by your distinction between the value of freedom versus the value, or in comparison to the value
dignity.
of dignity. Can you elaborate or share any
Well,
thoughts
look,
about that?
the United States adopted its Constitution in a period after there had been extensive battles for liberty or freedom. And the Constitution, the First Amendment, was intended to codify the defense of liberty. The dignity value that is reflected in European law particularly, but also in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, comes out of a different historical tradition. The German philosopher Jürgen Habermas has suggested that it is a combination of a derivation from Kantian principles, that is, every human life is an end unto itself and may not be used as an instrument for some other purpose. So that Kantian concept of dignity, a kind of Christian idea of dignity, and also a post-World War II reaction to what was revealed about the Nazi crimes. So the word dignity appears in the United Nations Charter. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights starts with the idea of dignity, repeats that in its first article. It starts with it in its preamble. The European Charter of Fundamental Rights, adopted by the European Union in 2009, says human dignity is inviolable, and then goes on to the need to defend human dignity at every point. And there is not the same commitment to freedom of expression in European law as there is in the United States. So if you take the European Convention on Human Rights, it has an Article 10 which deals with freedom of expression. And it's a full paragraph long. And the reason it's a full paragraph long is it has to state so many exceptions. So it states an exception with respect to defamation. It states an exception with respect to propaganda for war. It states an exception with threats to public order, things which would be considered intolerable in the United States. My own view is that I would like to protect liberty as it is understood in the United States. I would also like to protect dignity as it is understood in Europe. I recognize, as in the hate speech example, that there are places where they come into conflict. And in that instance, I'm in favor of the American approach which makes hate speech punishable only on the basis of context, not on the basis of content. But I think there are these separate values, and Americans don't tend to be cognizant that almost all the rest of the world has a different set of values when it comes to rights than we have in the United States. And my point was that if the United States hopes to prevail in some of these arguments dealing with freedom of expression, if the United States doesn't stand firm for freedom of expression on an international basis, in effect, it is undercutting itself in dealing with issues like, say, the right to be forgotten.
I'm Joel Simon from the Committee to Protect Journalists. Aryeh, at a time when the United States is led by a president who is unable and certainly unwilling to exert U.S. influence in defense of human rights and free expression around the world, there have been questions raised about what influence the U.S. has had historically. What are the greatest examples that you see in your career of U.S. influence being exercised positively in defense of free expression and human rights?
Well, I think there are many examples that could be cited. I think the Carter administration probably deserves credit for incorporating human rights into U.S. foreign policy, although I would say that there were a few members of Congress in the period before Carter became president, led by Representative Don Fraser of Minnesota, who paved the way for Carter's human rights policy. The Helsinki agreements had been negotiated during the period that Gerald Ford was president, but the Carter administration took the lead in promoting the human rights components of the Helsinki agreement, and that had a great effect in the Soviet Union and in countries such as Poland and Czechoslovakia, and gave rise to the human rights movements in those countries. And I think that the human rights movements in those countries had at least a role, a significant role, not necessarily the entire role, but a significant role in helping to bring about the revolutions that took place in that region, and also the consequent end of the Cold War. During the 1980s, virtually every country in Latin America that was a military dictatorship, and most were military dictatorships in that period, transformed into a democracy and, for the most part, not entirely, a human rights supporting democracy. And the same thing happened in a number of countries of East Asia in that period, in South Korea and the Philippines, in Taiwan, somewhat later on in Indonesia. Very often that involved conflicts by the human rights community with the Reagan administration. And yet, against Reagan's own wishes, in his second term, his administration contributed to the end of the Duvalier dictatorship in Haiti, the end of the Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines, and the end of the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. And again, the transitions that took place in 1987 in South Korea, the transition that took place in the Philippines with Cory Aquino coming into office, all reflected in various ways U.S. policies, sometimes against the Reagan administration, with members of Congress and the press and the human rights community leading the effort against those of the government. At any rate, I could go on, but I think those are significant accomplishments.
Jeffrey Abramson, University of Texas School of Law. Listening to you summarize the 6 episodes,
yes.
I was struck by, at some point, they seem less episodic and more like Lego blocks locking onto each other. And yet, despite that, from 1920s through the 1970s summary of the history of the challenges, it struck me that you come out, especially about national security card being played after 9/11, saying there's always been sufficient pushback
Yes.
to hold the line.
There was more pushback after Vietnam than at any time previously.
So this is my question. Could we, before we adjourn today, sort of locate where that pushback, what's crucial to that pushback? It isn't the courts, because from Debs to Dennis, the court is signing off on much of the legislation
Right.
you're talking about.
No, I
So
think, look, I think Jeffrey Stone errs by attributing most of this to the courts. I think it came from civil society in the United States, from the press, from the universities, and from the non-governmental organizations. Okay, thank you.
Aryeh, thank you very much.